Eva King. Leah, if you could raise your hand and wave to everybody. Leah will often travel when I'm preaching somewhere. She is our Director of Mission Advancement. And so one of the things that we don't steal in the Lutheran Church. I call it sanctified borrowing. So we have borrowed her from the Synod. She worked for the Synod in advancement. And part of what Leah's able to do in her position with Missouri District is she's able to travel and see the mission work that we talk about. Whereas, I saw that next week you're going to have a missionary from Cambodia who will be here. I've not been to Stronghold, but I know the missionary Jesse in Cambodia. I've been over there. Most people don't get to go to Cambodia. Leah's able to talk about the mission work of the Missouri District. And so one of the things, if there's something that's near and dear to your heart in terms of mission work, she can kind of fill you in on things that your mission dollars go to support. Because one of the questions we get is, when we give to the district and Synod, where's that money go? Well, two quick things. One thing it does is when we work with the congregation in the call process, it does that. But about $750,000 go to specific mission projects across Missouri, from campus ministry to new mission starts to work in rural settings or urban settings. So if there's some type of work that is important to you, you can talk to Leah about that. So she likes to come along and just be able to make connections with congregations and folks. So we're glad she was able to make it down here with us this morning. Let me give you a little idea of what is my goal and purpose with you this morning. I'm going to talk specifically about intentional interim ministry as a possible transition for this congregation after Pastor Mech retires. I'm going to explain what intentional interim ministry is, but I'm also going to talk specifically about why it could be a very beneficial thing for Immanuel. I will say intentional interim pastors there aren't a plethora of them, and it's not used a lot, but both Immanuel and Good Shepherd in Carthage have both been blessed by intentional interim pastors previously. So if you've been in Immanuel for a while, Pastor Rick Foss is a trained intentional interim pastor. Good Shepherd in Carthage, after Pastor Schnackenberg retired, was served by an intentional interim pastor. So I'm going to first say, well, what is an intentional interim pastor? I'm not going to read. I don't like people to just come in and read what's on the sheet. You all, I'm confident, can read through that. You can also ask good questions based upon what's here. But I want to start by saying, well, what is an intentional interim pastor? First of all, and Jason, do I need to stand still?
It keeps me busy. It keeps me paying attention.
Okay. An intentional interim pastor is a called pastor, first and foremost, which means that an intentional interim pastor will preach the word, administer the sacraments, visit the sick, the shut-ins, will conduct baptisms, celebrate the sacraments, will do funerals and weddings, everything that a pastor does. They are specifically trained to help congregations that have either experienced some kind of significant loss, conflict, or to aid in a transition. I'll talk about what those can be in a moment. But an intentional interim pastor is your called pastor who will serve your congregation. You don't have to worry, well, will the shut-ins be visited? The shut-ins will be visited. Will the kids have confirmation class? Absolutely. Everything that a pastor does, an interim pastor does. The benefit of an intentional interim training. Here are the kind of key elements of that. First of all, there is no, I don't want to say no. It minimizes the anxiety about the transition because you know that you are being spiritually cared for through a shepherd as soon as the interim pastor is installed. Congregations that have a vacancy pastor, or if they don't name a vacancy pastor, you can sometimes go through the anxiety of who's going to be here from one week to the next preaching. Are they going to be able to handle confirmation and shut-ins and all of those things? Many vacancy pastors are only going to work 1 to 2 days a week. Part of the reason pastors retire is so they don't have to, well, really, they don't have to go to meetings. That's why they all retire. Pastors love to preach. It's the evening meetings that leads them into retirement. But when you're being served by a vacancy pastor who's retired, he's not going to be, more than likely, putting in the same hours and commitment as a full-time pastor. So one of the first things is it minimizes that anxiety or fear about who is going to shepherd the flock. That's clear from day one. Second, the congregation then can approach the call process without a sense of urgency. There's no need to rush. We're not having to zip through things because we know that God is providing for our congregation through the interim pastor. And in fact, the interim pastor, God is using to help prepare us for receiving our next pastor. It's part of what Pastor Foss did when he had served this congregation previously. The third thing that it does is when a congregation is in an area where there are not a lot of available pastors to serve, Joplin's a long way from St. Louis where we've got a lot of pastors. There aren't tons of pastors that are available in this area. So part of what it does is it means that your congregation, with a Lutheran school, with a strong youth ministry program, that you have a pastor who can come in and serve alongside of a strong ministry from day one. That you're not kind of having to take a step back in terms of all of the aspects of ministry that go on here at Immanuel and Martin Luther School. By having an intentional interim pastor, you can have a full-time pastor who is able to work alongside of Jason and Jeremy and all of the folks who are involved in ministry here at Immanuel. Intentional interim pastors often will serve after there's been a significant conflict and a pastor's left, or to some extent help a congregation process grief. That can come in a couple of ways. Invite your prayers for our congregations in Lincoln, Missouri. Pastor Leonard Pompey was called to his Lord earlier this week as a result of COVID complications. Faithful pastors serve the dual parish. Those two congregations are going to be grieving. Quite often, when a pastor retires, there's there's grief. A congregation grieves losing someone who has walked with us through difficult times. Think of everything that's happened at this congregation in the years that Pastor Mech has been here. Admittedly, there will be grief. We can tease him just because you want to hear that laugh. That was a little too demonic, I think. But there will be grief. Pastor Mech walked with the people of God in Immanuel through the trauma of the tornado. In fact, as you all well know, he experienced the trauma with you. There will be grief after he retires. An interim pastor becomes, if you will, specifically steps in to prepare the congregation for the next pastor. That's part of what the training that they've received. The key to a healthy, intentional interim pastorate is not the time that the interim pastor spends, but the years of the pastor that follows him. The congregation I served, the congregation that I was ordained in, my family's home congregation in Western Kentucky, had two pastors who served 67 years between them, 33 and then 34 years. The recommendation was, after such a long pastorate, with your pastor retiring, and the grief that your congregation will undergo, the recommendation from the district president was that they should consider an intentional interim pastor. No, we know what we need. We want to move forward. They called a man, and he served for about 13 months. Was constantly compared to his predecessor. And he did things dramatically different than his predecessor. And it was an uncomfortable relationship, and he left. It was referred to as the unintentional interim pastor. Then they worked with the district, brought in an intentional interim pastor, and he served longer than his immediate predecessor to help the congregation to address issues of health so that they could then call and receive their next pastor who had a long pastorate there, longer. For a congregation that has been blessed by strong, faithful pastoral leadership over an extended period of time, it can be a great blessing. So I served at St. Paul's in Concordia, and after I was elected as district president, they brought in an intentional interim pastor. I had served 13 years there, but they had an intentional interim pastor who came in so that they told me it wasn't because I'd left a mess. I'm not sure. It depends upon the day. But that way, the new pastor, and they've had a senior pastor now for about 3.5 years, he wasn't constantly dealing with the comparisons and how he approached things differently. So here's what I hear about not the interim pastor, but the new young senior pastor they have. They often tell me it seems like he's been here forever, which in a small town is the highest of praise. Pastors they're not concerned about their legacy. They're concerned about the congregations they serve. Pastor Mech's prayer, my prayer, is that this congregation will be healthy, will be focused on bringing that healing to the community of Joplin for generations to come. And if having an interim pastor is a helpful step towards that, then that's why we think it would be a good thing. So one of the questions that will then be asked is, well, what's this mean for the call process? There are only about 80 trained interim pastors in the Synod across the country. And so what happens is, because there aren't an overabundance of them, we would ask that you don't start the call process for the first 6 months that the interim pastor is there. The interim pastor is helping the congregation work through some specific things. In addition to preaching and teaching and visiting and confirmation class and unfortunately evening meetings and all those type of things, your interim pastor also has specific goals that he's working towards. Those goals may be things like helping the congregation come to grips with their history, if there are specific conflicts that need to be addressed, working on their identity. Sometimes it's important for a congregation to realize who they are apart from speaking about their pastor. So think of it, if you know the other Lutheran churches down in this part of the state, the church in Lockwood, Immanuel in Lockwood, is having to think through, oh, we're not Pastor Griffin's church. It was a transition for Good Shepherd in Carthage to not think of, oh, I go to Pastor Schnackenberg's church. But to think of, here, who is Immanuel Lutheran Church? And how is God carrying out his work here at Immanuel? And to answer those questions without saying, Pastor Beck. So an intentional interim pastor is working through those things. And that's part of what that initial 6 months period would be, so that we would launch a call process at Immanuel after 6 months. A call process is often going to take probably around a year, give or take, before a first call is issued. Usually it could be a little bit less than that time period. But the main thing for the congregation is that is not having to be rushed through, but it is a process that is approached prayerfully, that is approached guided by the Word of God, that the congregation members are all informed, that they have input into the process. All of those things can happen at an appropriate pace without having to do it because we're worried about, we've just had this endless parade of guest pastors from one week to the next. So we've had a congregation it doesn't matter. We've had a congregation that the call process went on for almost 4 years. And in that time period, they resisted naming a vacancy pastor. And so they would have a couple different pastors for an extended period of time. But over 4 years, they've changed. Finally, they've named an intentional interim pastor to help them work through some internal issues so that they can get ready to call their next pastor. An intentional interim pastor means that we know who's going to be here on Sunday. Your family knows if there's a crisis who you can call. The care for God's people is clear for everyone involved, so that you can approach the call process trusting in the Lord's timing. A couple things that are worth noting. Because there are just a small number of intentional interim pastors, the way that it works, when the congregation says, we believe we'd like an intentional interim pastor, you even vote to do so. What will happen is, I'll give you the name, give to the leadership the name of one trained interim pastor for you to meet with. And you can say, yes, we think he would be a great fit for Immanuel, or the congregation's leaders can say, we're not sure that he's the right fit. We just don't have so many that we can give you a list of 5 or 6. And so, trust me when I say I know the congregation will work to try to find someone who's a good fit. Your leadership can have a conversation with him and then would recommend him to the congregation for a call. If he's not the right one, we'll give you the opportunity to have conversation with other interim pastors. So that it's still the congregation's call, and you have a chance to meet with them and determine for yourselves if he's the right fit. In terms of then when the call process would begin, here's what a timeline could look like. Your congregation could decide, we want to go with an interim pastor and make that determination, whether it's the fall, the winter, even late winter. If that determination is made, we can enable you to have a conversation in the springtime with a potential interim pastor, provided there's someone who's identified, so that after Pastor Mech's retirement, that sometime thereafter, the interim could be able to start. So, if Pastor Mech's retirement is effectively June 1st, loosely in June or July, your interim pastor starts, we would probably look to begin the call process for a pastor who would remain, your, quote, permanent pastor, sometime in January, and go through the steps of the call process. If the congregation were to determine that you don't want to go with an intentional interim, but you want to begin the call process, part of my encouragement would be that you would not begin most of the steps of the call process until after Pastor Mech's retirement. For a couple of reasons. One, it allows you to go through the process of honoring your pastor. Secondly, it does, when a congregation goes through the survey process while a retiring pastor's there, that shapes the answers in the survey. Especially the longer a pastor's been someplace. So my encouragement would be that you wait to really begin until after I could come and meet with a call committee beforehand, but you're not going to really begin the call process until after Pastor Mech's retirement. So it doesn't stretch things out to some long extended process. It potentially is going to make things 3 to 6 months longer in terms of process by having an intentional interim pastor. Chief concern in all of this is to care for the flock. What is it we call a pastor to do? To be a shepherd. And having an interim pastor, especially when you're limited on the number of pastors who could provide full-time service, it seems to be a strong option for the congregation that I would recommend that you strongly consider. On the sheet, there are lots of, it's intended to be a frequently asked question document, so hopefully it goes over some of those things. But what questions do you all have? Yes?
With only 80 available, can you wait? They're recording this. With only 80 available intentional interims, what's the likelihood of having them with thousands of churches across the country?
Sure. Having some advance notice helps. And what I mean is, usually an interim pastor more than likely is following a pastor that takes a call, has been my experience in the 6 years, more than following a retirement. And part of what that means is if we don't have a pastor, a trained interim pastor available in Missouri, I can contact the national organization, and what they're able to do is they have a directory of them all, and they have the timelines that they're going to, that they think they're going to be available. And so what we would be able to do then is, if we're talking March, April, in the springtime, I can make a contact and say, we're looking for a pastor to serve in Missouri in the time frame of June and July. That might result in several. It might result in very few. But I've only run into that in one case where there simply wasn't someone available. But what then I do is I have conversations with the man or men to determine if they're a right fit. There are a lot of moving parts at Immanuel and Martin Luther. And what I mean is, this is not a small church that is incredibly conflicted, which is sometimes what the trained interim pastors do. This is a congregation with multiple staff members and a school. And so it's got to be someone who's comfortable with that. I do think that we would, having some notice, my prayer is that we'll have options. So, I can't guarantee anything, but having advance notice is far more helpful than not. So when I was elected district president, it was June, and I took office in July. They wanted an interim pastor, and there wasn't anyone available immediately. And they got an interim pastor in about, I would say, September, late September, maybe early October. Now, granted, their problem was the new district president had no idea what he was doing. But at least now I've got a little more idea, and I also would have advance notice. Other questions back in the back?
Okay, I would just like, I really don't read that. Oh, okay. I would like to say that in the period that we had the interim pastor before, it wasn't always a positive experience for member of the congregation. That being said, the next week could be fine. However, if I'm reading this and listening to this correctly, it would be at least probably 2 years before we would have a regular pastor. Am I interpreting this correct? We couldn't have an interim until Pastor Mech leaves. Then we have to wait another 6 months before we ever start the process. And the process isn't something that we do overnight.
Right.
So we are looking at it probably at least 2 years without a permanent pastor.
Yes. And what you'll find is the regular call process is going to, at minimum, take 12 to 18 months. So
it could be longer than 2 years.
Yes. Whether you have an interim or not. And so I think the question, yes, the call process can take, it's going to take months. It's potentially going to take more than a year and a half. The question is, do you have a vacancy pastor helping you through the transition who's probably part-time, or do you have a full-time pastor in place during that? And so that's one of the things for the congregation to weigh is in either direction, the call process is going to take a year and a half, approximately. So how is your congregation going to be cared for during that time period?
But you say the interim pastor is only to be here a couple of days a week. Is that what you said?
No, ma'am. A vacancy pastor is often either serving another congregation or is retired. And so a vacancy pastor would be like, let's just say Pastor Silas Mail was your vacancy pastor. He could come over and serve 1 day a week to do shut-in calls and confirmation class, and then he would lead service. Or if it's a retired pastor, it's going to be 1 day during the week and on Sunday, maybe 2, but you're not going to have, more than likely with a vacancy pastor, full-time ministry.
But with the interim pastor?
The interim pastor would be full-time. The one caveat would be, because they are moving here and their family doesn't necessarily move with them, they will work out with you an arrangement so that it may be that the pastor is on for a significant number of days and then gone for 3 days to be able to go home with family. So the pastor that served down in Carthage when I first came to the office, his wife was in Michigan, and so he would serve at Good Shepherd. He would be there for a couple of weeks, or actually several, and then when he would go home, he'd go home for like 5 or 6 days. So that would all be something that you would discuss with the interim pastor based upon where he's from.
So in other words, when we call an interim pastor, we can negotiate with him the amount of days that he would be serving here for our congregation.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And that's some of the conversation with me. If the expectation for Immanuel is full-time, I won't provide you with part-time interim pastors, which there are some that would do it part-time. I think the expectation is that this is full-time. Yes.
Pastor, talk just a minute about the way they handle, salaries and benefits and insurance and things like that for an interim pastor. How is that? Is that directed by the district?
So it is different than a regular call in that the pastors, when they end their service, they don't always have a guarantee of when their next call will happen. And so part of the agreement is that the congregation will, I'm just going to use kind of the secular worldly term, the congregation would offer a severance package for after the term of service for a certain period of time unless he accepts a call within that time period. And so what that does is that's the parachute, if you will, so that he's got health insurance and he's got salary because he has an obligation to his own family. The salary would be commensurate for his age and his experience. Our intentional interim pastors, by and large, are men in their 60s. Sometimes there may be some in their 50s, but they are veterans. And so that means that none of them are going to make a decision based. They don't want to come because the salary is so attractive, but they also feel that they have to provide for their family. So they may not be able to come for a lesser salary, which, you have a pastor who's in his 60s. So I don't think that is going to be the same kind of an issue for some churches.
On the bottom of the first page, it's listed continuing education, auspices of the National Association of Lutheran Interim Pastors, Interim Ministry Network. That is providing education. These pastors are all LCMS rostered pastors, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so they're just so for clarification, because these are not terms that I'm familiar with on a day-to-day basis, and this
Nope,
is an
that's
ongoing
fine.
education process. So I just want to make sure that if somebody goes home and reads this, that they know that we're still staying within the LCMS.
Yes. It will be an LCMS trained pastor. Ideally, it would be a pastor who's serving in Missouri District. Currently, we've got a number of retired men who will do part-time interim calls, which has changed a lot. We don't have a lot. We really only have one or two who will do full-time. And so it could be that we have to look outside of Missouri for Immanuel.
And the consideration with that too, when you're talking about wages, you got a family that's living somewhere else. When that consideration time comes, we need to look at the cost of living for those people where they're living at and what it's going to take to compensate to cover their families too. So that's going to be a point of consideration also for us.
And that's also a part of their training in that that's something that they discuss within the NALA group, because they all deal with it, especially if they go from place to place in the country. I mean, Dr. Foss, who Pastor Rick, as he had served here, is currently doing an interim in California, which is where he was from. And I'm sure the cost of living is dramatically different there than here in Missouri. Huh?
Not as much as you would think. I came from California.
Okay. I think we got one here.
Is it generally considered desirable for all congregations to have an interim pastor, or could you play the advocate and say, well, in certain cases, it's maybe just as well to go directly into a call process?
I don't recommend interim calls for every congregation. Part of the challenge now is that a lot of congregations, when their pastor retires, one of the questions is about what kind of a salary are they able to offer because their congregation is not as large as it once was. And so for some of those congregations, to call an interim pastor who's in his 60s is cost prohibitive, if you will. So there are definitely congregations where it's not something that is recommended because they're just not in a position where they're able to do it. Also, they may not need the skill set of an interim pastor. So when I consider a congregation and whether they need an interim pastor, a couple of things that go through my mind is the overall health of a congregation. Is there significant conflict? The size and scope of the ministry, and the availability of other pastors who could provide support, full-time or otherwise. Part of why it made sense to me here at Immanuel is because of the size of the congregation and the lack of having really full-time pastoral ministry options in the area. And so I don't see the significant conflict here, but it is, I think the expectation at Immanuel is probably greater than just a pastor coming in 1 or 2 days a week. And that's what a vacancy pastor would more than likely provide. Even in St. Louis, it is hard to find vacancy pastors who will do full-time work. The pastors who've retired don't want to make that kind of a commitment. And we've just suddenly been hit with, we've got 4 retirements, one accepted a call and 3 retirements. And so we've really been hit in St. Louis in the last couple of months, probably 6 months. And one church very definitely wanted a full-time interim pastor, or a vacancy pastor, just vacancy. And we couldn't find someone. It had to be someone who was part-time. Other questions you all have?
What's been your experience when you get within a congregation, when the interim pastor comes, does normal Sunday attendance go up or down?
It's hard to gauge that because is it following a beloved pastor who retired, or is it following a pastor who took a call when there was significant conflict? It's different from one case to the next. Part of what's nice with interim pastors is, I joked last night, I was talking to Bill and Jason afterwards, guys like Pastor Foss, they like to get in and figure out what's going on. And one of the ways that they do that is by sitting down with people. And Jerry, tell me, what brought you to Immanuel? And what do you like about Immanuel? What's your prayer for Immanuel for the future? And listening and getting to know people. I would say it's always a good thing for any pastor to do, but intentional interim pastors are really good at it. And that does draw people in. That the pastor cares for me and wants to hear from me. They may not always, I'm going to hit myself for starting down this road. They're not always going to be Ozzy Hoffman. And if you know what I said there, you're an old Lutheran. They're not necessarily always gifted as preachers like, the best in the Synod. But they're great at helping congregations go through transitions. And that's what the goal to me for a congregation that's bringing in an interim is. Was that helpful?
This is not necessarily about the interim, but about the call process. Can you ask a question about that? So we're down 6 months into the road. Does the interim pastor start surveys with the congregation about what they want so they help with that call process?
So the interim pastor doesn't facilitate the call process. The district does, and so that would mean I would come in and meet with the call committee. The circuit visitor will work with the call committee, and that's now Pastor Fitchie. He has taken over for Pastor Mech. So he will be the one who works with the call committee. And then we'll have a staff member who will facilitate a survey of the congregation. And that survey will be about exactly asking questions about where does Immanuel want to go in the future? What are ministry priorities? What are the things that the members say, this needs to be stronger as we look to the future? So the survey is vital in hearing from all segments of the congregation. And that's done electronically, and we also have the ability to do it in a printed format. I mean, even one of the things I said last night was, Jason could get work with the high school kids. They could have iPads in the back probably, and just anybody, older adult, or not even older, anybody that hates the internet could just go back with one of the high school kids and do the survey in 5 minutes. So we've got all of that ability to do it, and it's all done. We can do it in a printed format, but it goes so much easier with it being online, getting the data.
So my other question is about the call committee itself. Who determines the call committee?
Your bylaws should stipulate that. And Bill, I don't know if you've looked at your bylaws.
It does.
As to a certain number of members? Or
Yeah,
what?
it's, I don't have to remember it off the top of my head, but it's right into the Constitution in our bylaws.
So the question is about who makes up the call committee, and it's stipulated in the bylaws.
Okay. So is that representatives of the congregation?
It's, yeah, I mean, they're elected, most of them are elected officers, but that doesn't mean that it could actually also be sent to the Board of Elders and have the Board of Elders handle it. In our bylaws, there's several different caveats in there of how it can transpire, but it does list certain officers, and then, you'd want to probably expand and have some extra people added in to make sure you can facilitate all what's needed here at our congregation as we did last time.
Okay. Well, I'm just hoping that the representation of the whole congregation is the people that are on different, let's say lay people for a term, from a different committee or so forth. So it's not just necessarily all elected officials, which I'm just going to say tend to be all male.
Well, it's not going to be all male.
Okay,
It
just-
wasn't last time.
Well,
And the other thing is,
I just want that because
well,
I want some younger people on this committee. We need that representation from our younger members.
That's why some of these people should run for office and do not run.
Well, and I'll say something. I met with a church the other night in St. Louis with a call committee, and the seminary student, because he's a vicar, but the seminary student who's there at the congregation is assigned or attended the meeting. And so when I kind of got done, I said, well, what do you think? This is your first exposure. He said, no, it's not. When I was in high school, our church went through a call process, and they asked me to serve on the call committee. So I'll even throw out, if your bylaws don't get so precise that you've got some flexibility, go to Jason and say, hey, could you identify a youth that might serve on call committee? That would be valuable input to hear from them as well. So, when we did it in Concordia, and, one of our call committee members said, well, when it comes time for voting, they can't vote. They're not old enough. But man, think about how much they can learn about their church, and they can have a voice in the process. Isn't this something that we want to do and can be really helpful? So, if you've got that flexibility in what your bylaws state, ask a high school young person to serve on there.
So forgive me if you covered this earlier, but the question I have is, the stark reality, you were mentioning there are a number of retired pastors in the St. Louis area. Of course, St. Louis and Fort Wayne have graduates coming out of the seminary, but what is the reality of, percentage of those retiring versus those who are newly trained? And also we've had a couple Concordias closed down in the last several years, and what's the reality? How difficult is it to find pastors?
A lot of times there's concern that the number of graduates from our seminaries each year are less than they were a few years ago. And is that a concern? Yes. But that's also not fully the right question to ask, is how many congregations can be calling? I am not concerned about, I'm basically making a case for an intentional interim pastor with you. But when the time comes for Immanuel to call, I'm not concerned that Immanuel will be unable to get a pastor. Now, please don't. Hagan said we'll get our first call accepted. I wrote it down. Please don't say that. But I'm not concerned about that. But what I do want, and here's where I'm going to sow some seeds. The future of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, in every district, in every circuit, is going to look different than it did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. One church, one pastor. We're going to have to be more creative, and we're going to have to work together more. It's going to mean, rather than small congregations struggling to make it and not having anything for the one young family in their congregation, why can't we work together? For the sake of our young people, for the sake of our families. So here's how it can look. At St. Paul in New Melly, Missouri, it is a charter congregation of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. One of the originals. New Melly, it's old school. It's an old church where the pulpit is literally above the altar. That was the Perry County tradition. Many of you are that dyed-in-the-wool LCMS. So it's an old congregation. Their pastor died in office, and they weren't able to afford to call it their next pastor. We've led conversation in the area, and so they worked with Immanuel in Wentzville. Wentzville has been an area of the state where it was just continuing to grow. People had moved from North County out to St. Charles, and then they just kept moving farther out. And so Wentzville, they're building their 4th high school in Wentzville now. It's just growing like crazy. So the pastor at New Melly was called there from the seminary, but he serves also part-time at Immanuel in Wentzville. And they're able to do youth programs together. So rather than the family that's got the 2 high school kids saying, wow, they don't have anything for us here at St. Paul New Melly, no, we're working together. So a couple of weeks ago, I ordained a pastor at Immanuel, and Barnhart. So if you go south of St. Louis on 55, it's a church that's up on the hill, literally overlooking I-55. Some of you may have seen it before. That pastor, it's very similar. He has worked with the church at St. John's in Arnold so that they weren't able to call him fully on their own. And so it's been a collaborative ministry together. Sarcoxy closed. Pastor Lampy, who's serving in Aurora, at some point he's going to want to have a transition. Those same conversations for other places they exist for Southwest Missouri. They even exist in St. Louis and Kansas City. The issues aren't rural. It's rural, it's urban, it's suburban. So I'm not saying that this is something that truly affects your call process. But at some point, Pastor Geis from our staff, he and I will probably come down to Southwest Missouri, and we'll invite the elders from Immanuel to a meeting with elders from all the other churches and say, can we work together? You guys aren't competing with Good Shepherd. You're not competing with other congregations. We're fighting against Satan. And we're fighting against a world that is confused about everything. Our congregations aren't the opposition. We're on the same team. And we want children and youth and families to be strong at all of our small congregations, as well as our larger ones. So if there are ways we can work together. You know who does it well? LWML does it well. They work together. We used to do it with youth. Who's old enough? Walther League. Walther League was across congregations. Somebody may have met their spouse in Walther League. But those were things that we used to do together more. Somewhere along the lines, we all got kind of large enough that we want our pastor. And we don't want to share him with anyone else. He's not our pastor. He's God's man. And so how can we work together for the future? It's a tangent, but it's the reality. It's also why my hair is going white. Because this is the stress and concern for the future is how are we going to cover all of our small congregations? So the long answer is I feel very good about Immanuel calling a pastor when the time comes.
But it's not just us, because there's smaller congregations around us. And I can see that in the future, some need to.
Yes.
Sure.
I think it's known widely, though, that when you're charitable and you give and you share, that you grow. You always grow. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind when it comes to that time. We got a little church down here in Neosho that's about to shutter. Why?
So one of the things that we're going to do at the district level is we're going to have an emphasis called Help the Next Generation, where we are going to train coaches to work with congregations on ministry to families. And what I mean is, a lot of churches think that the only way we can have ministry to families is through Sunday school. Folks, the Christian church ministered to families for 1,900 years before anyone ever came up with Sunday school. There are other ways to do it. And so we're going to train about 20 coaches from across the state to be able to work with congregations to help them equip families to teach the faith at home. So the congregation that I served, we had, for 2 years, we had directors of family ministry from Concordia and Ann Arbor as interns. And what we did was, rather than just giving out the Bible and the catechism, which a lot of churches do, we began tweaking what we were doing. We would give out the Bible in 2nd grade and the catechism in 3rd grade. And that's all we would do. So what we began doing was, with everything like that, these milestones, we would bring the families in and we would teach the parents how to use a Bible. We can't assume things. We want to show the parents how they can help their child use the Bible. Yes, for religion homework in the school, but how they can use it for family devotions. Same with the catechism. So it was a simple way to help equip families for passing on the faith. Pastor Mech, Mr. Schomburg, Jason can all tell you their jobs are better when the kids are hearing the same thing at home that they are at church and school. Doesn't mean we're going to go back to the 1950s. Families are still going to be busy and on the run. But when we would do a children's sermon, we would have something that the families would take home. A simple Bible reading, a prayer, a couple of questions, and an object that they could take home themselves. We wanted to bridge to the home. So one of the things that we may do is we may contact Immanuel and say, we would like to train Jason to be one of our coaches, to be able to invest in other congregations in Southwest Missouri. Jason's up there going, gosh, I got a lot to do. Leave me out of it. They've got a director of family ministry from Ann Arbor at Trinity Springfield now. Redeemer Springfield has a new DCE. So it's good that we've got some folks that are trained in youth and family ministry down in Southwest Missouri, but let's share their gifts with some of the smaller congregations. So here's what it can look like. The Rolla circuit runs from St. Clair to St. Robert. That's a long stretch of interstate. They don't have a lot of young people, of children and families in those congregations. But can they work together? Let's see them all come together in Rolla quarterly, where we bring in some trained professionals that equip those families. It's not that the church can't do these things. We're stronger and better together when we're sharing the gifts that God has given us for the sake of the kingdom. Every now and then I get teased. Someone will say, how many congregations are there in the Missouri district? I'll say 290. Well, what happened? There used to be over 300. Yeah, I'm really working to close the congregations in the Missouri district. That's what our goal is. President Murley and all his predecessors, we wanted to expand. Now we want to close. No, that's not the case. Which is why, for the future, we want to work together. Immanuel is a key congregation in Southwest Missouri. You all are blessed. There's so much to be thankful for. There are things to be concerned about for the future. But there's a rich history of the ministry here at this congregation. You're blessed to have a Lutheran school that's shaping young people and their families. And, in my years in Missouri, what I saw here 10 years ago, only God could do. I mean, those of you that were members here 10 years ago, you all didn't know what you were doing either. And the most amazing stuff was happening here because God was at work. And part of when Pastor Mech came up and spoke at our congregation and just talked about it, when everybody else had left, the care was still happening here at Immanuel. People were being fed. They could come here for a shower. They could come for a bed. God's not done with this place. And my hope and prayer is that this place, Immanuel, is an anchor for ministry in Southwest Missouri and even beyond, even in Kansas, even in Oklahoma, that we can provide support beyond. Do we say even Arkansas?
That's another guess.
I'll give you an example. We're having a conversation in the Boot Heel, and the president of that district and I have talked about that at some point we're going to bring them up from Arkansas, or we're going to drive down from Missouri to talk about how we can work together. Now, I'm well aware that Norm Stewart wouldn't even buy gas for the team bus in Kansas. But for the sake of the gospel, we'll work together, right? Just not the Jayhawk fans. Other questions? If you have questions, please feel free to give them to Bill. Bill's gotten to know my assistant, Michelle, well. We'll get you answers if you have questions. But here's what I'm going to ask for you. I'm going to ask for you to pray. For you to pray for what comes next. When Bill and I talked about, this scenario, part of what my concern is, this comes from my years in Concordia. People don't like being put on the spot to make a decision. They like to have time to think about it, to pray about it, to not walk into one meeting. I didn't know this was being discussed. You're asking us to make a big decision about the future, and I'm just learning about it. We want you to have time to consider, to pray about it. Intentional interim pastors are not the magic bullet. They're not going to make an interim pastor is not going to make everything great at Immanuel. They're different. They have different gifts and abilities. But I do think it is something that could be helpful for the ministry here at Immanuel as you transition. Because any way you cut it, the congregation's going to have a transition. Pastor Mech's retiring. There will be a transition. But I'm going to leave you with this. I was talking in Jefferson City about vacant churches. And Pastor Holbroch, who's one of our retired pastors up there, pulled me aside. And he's just a very sincere man. And he said, "Dear brother, there are no vacant churches because Christ is always present with his people." And I thanked him. I still fall into the habit of using that word vacant. But let me remind you, when June 1 rolls around, you won't be vacant. No matter what steps are being determined by the congregation, Christ is present for his people here. The word will be preached. The sacraments will be administered. You're not vacant. Christ is here. And that's what gives us hope and comfort. Thank you all for the opportunity. If you have questions for me, feel free to come see me. I'll also just say, if you want to hear about anything exciting in terms of the work of Missouri District, find Leah. I don't know if Immanuel participated in Shine, but Shine was our district-wide servant event that we had this spring. It was over a 10-day period where we had 130 groups that participated in serving their community. More than 5,000 people, members of our congregations, students in our schools, participated in Shine. Leah was the brains, the broad. Leah was the young lady behind it. So she'd be happy to tell you about it or connect you with what it'll look like next year for Shine, the sequel, when it rolls around too. So we'd love to have Immanuel and Martin Luther participate in it. Thank you so much again. God's blessings to you all.